Today is the 22nd of October, and the news from the Middle East remains extremely difficult, but with no sign of any fundamental change in the situation, at least not for the moment. So far, we still have a situation where Israeli forces are assembling close to the Gaza Strip. Israel continues to bomb the Gaza Strip, Gaza City. Large numbers of civilian casualties are killed. Hamas launches its own rockets and missiles towards Israel. Some of these get through. Damage takes place. I'm less familiar with whether or not there have been civilian casualties, but I'm sure that there are. It's just that in the immensity of the news that is going on, it's not been tracked so carefully. And at the moment, we are in a situation where we're still waiting to see what exactly it is that the Israelis intend to do. Now, in previous programs, I've discussed a possible strategic dilemma that Israel might find itself in. This was very much, I should say, predicated on the assumption that Hamas is a formidable fighting force, deeply embedded into Gaza, able to organize large numbers of trained and motivated fighters to fight and hold back Israel. And there's been some reports which suggest that that is indeed the case. And I was reading this morning in the Daily Telegraph an astonishing article, at least to me personally it was astonishing, which said that the United States, the White House, people in the National Security Council are concerned that if Israel does attack Gaza, does send troops, I should say, into Gaza. It is already attacking Gaza. It is bombing the city. But anyway, if Israeli troops were to enter Gaza and Hamas were to put up a determined resistance and Israel were to become bogged down, then the prospect of Hezbollah entering the fray and starting some kind of serious battle in the north would increase, and there is no absolute certainty, there's no confidence on the part of the Americans that the Israeli armed forces, the IDF, would be equal to that challenge of a two-front war fighting Hamas in the south, in Gaza, and Hezbollah simultaneously to the north. Now, I have to say, I don't know whether that is the case, and against that argument, there was that long discussion I had from a former military person who has been providing me with a great deal of information about, well, many things, but who pointed out that he'd observed the Hamas fighters, the videos of the Hamas fighters, and he thinks that the levels of training and organisation and motivation of those fighters may have been overstated. So there is a contrary view. But anyway, that is the view of the United States, or at least apparently of some people in the United States. Now, to people like myself, born in the 1960s, with memories of the Six-Day War and of the 1973 war, that is an astonishing state of affairs. That Israel, which in 1967 was able to defeat the entire military of multiple Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, in the space of 6 weeks, occupy the whole of Sinai, and including, by the way, Gaza at that time, and of course the whole of the West Bank, and able to capture Jerusalem, and able thereafter to conduct air operations deep into Egyptian territory, beyond the Suez Canal, launching airstrikes repeatedly on Cairo, as I remember well from my childhood, obliging, in the end, the Soviet Union, which was the major ally of the Arab states, to intervene directly, obliging the Soviets to send thousands of troops and air defense missiles and MiG fighter jets to Egypt in what the Soviets referred to as Operation Kafkaz, to stabilize the situation and to repel attacks by Israel beyond the Suez Canal. Well, that Israel, and the Israel that subsequently, in the 1973 October War, the war that is often referred to as the Yom Kippur War, because the Arab states launched their attack on Israel over the course of that war, timing it for a Jewish holiday, the holiday of Yom Kippur. Anyway, again, I remember how Israel, obviously with the support of the United States, the unstinting support of the United States, was able, after being taken by surprise, after being put on the defensive, was able to reverse the situation, to surround the Egyptian forces in Sinai, to withstand the attack by multiple Arab armies from many Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq. The Iraqi involvement in that war is often disregarded. And anyway, it was able to fight, with the backing of the Americans, the Arab states to a standstill. Now, about the 1973 war, I understand that there are many nuances. People will point out to me the incompetent leadership of some people in Egypt. Lots of things are said about, a lot of criticisms have made, for example, of some decisions made during that war by President Sadat of Egypt. Others will point out violations by the Israelis of ceasefires and things of that kind. But the key point was that Israel was able to fight the Arabs in that war to a standstill. And that was the regular armies of the Arab states, backed at that time by the Soviet Union. Now, today's Israel, according to this report in the Daily Telegraph, and according to this report, view that's been expressed in the United States, in the National Security Council, in the White House, this Israel, the Israel of today, apparently might not be equal to fighting two Arab militias. Hamas, which has evolved in a territory, Gaza, which the Israelis have basically had surrounded, and where they control the access points into Egypt and have done so for many years. In fact, since control of Gaza was ceded by Israel in the early 2000s, and Hezbollah to the north. Now, again, I accept one has to qualify this. Hamas is a motivated force, undoubtedly, and Hezbollah has the unstinting backing of Iran. And in saying all of this, I want to make it clear that it's not Israel's declining capability that is the whole of the story. It is the rising, the growing capability of the Arab states, of the Arabs generally, so that apparently even Arab militias today are better organised and better motivated and stronger than they were in the past. But it still seems to me astonishing that things have changed so completely. And if this report in the Daily Telegraph is true, if there are these concerns in the United States, well, it would suggest that the Americans are having doubts about their ally, and that is something that Israel needs to perhaps start thinking about and taking into account. The key thing to understand is that the alliance that was forged between the United States and Israel already existed to a great extent from the time when Israel was founded in the 1940s and undoubtedly deepened thereafter. But it really took definitive form after the 1967 Six-Day War. And one of the reasons why the United States was confident was so committed to support for Israel after 1967 is because it was fully confident that in any prolonged war, any war with the Arabs or any combination of the Arab states, Israel would be able to make a determined fight for itself and would be able to win. That made, from the perspective of the Americans, Israel a key strategic ally. It was obviously the military giant of the Middle East. But secondly, it also meant that the US could commit itself to supporting Israel without having to fear that it might become drawn into a prolonged war itself on Israel's behalf because of weakness on the part of its ally, or perhaps I should say vulnerability on the part of its ally. If the situation really has changed, then it will change eventually the nature of the relationship between Israel and the United States as well, and will in time cause inevitably a deepening, a weakening, not a deepening, a weakening of the US-Israel alliance. Sentiment, of course, does drive alliances, and there is overwhelming, well, there is very strong, still very strong support for Israel, emotional support for Israel in the United States. But sentiment is an unreliable basis upon which to assume that alliances can be sustained. In my experience, alliances that are purely based on sentiment rarely survive for very long. And this is something which I think the government of Israel, the leaders of Israel, need to think about and to assess and to draw their conclusions, that perhaps this alliance with the United States that they have relied upon for so long might start to become more shaky than it has been in the past. Anyway, but let me stress again, this very much depends on whether those apprehensions which, according to the Daily Telegraph, exist in the United States, that there are doubts in Washington about Israel's ability to conduct simultaneously a two-front war against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah on the Lebanon border are true, are correct, if Hamas is weaker than is widely believed, then of course the situation is different and the long-term calculus changes. Anyway, that is one thing that I did want to talk about and discuss briefly, because it does seem to me it is important. I would also add, since we've touched on the history of the relationship between the United States and Israel, I would also like to draw brief attention to a very important article which has been published by John Helmer in Dancing with Bears, in which he discusses an important aspect of the policy of the situation in the Middle East, part of the history of the modern politics of the Middle East, which is that what has taken place in the Middle East is that the United States and its allies there, not just Israel, worked overtime throughout the 1960s, 70s and 80s and beyond to defeat Arab secular left-wing movements. Now, it's often forgotten that at the time of the 1967 Six-Day War, socialism, secular socialism, was perhaps the single strongest political force in the Arab world. Many Arab countries at that time professed socialism of one form or another, included the single biggest Arab state of all, which was Gamal Nasser's Egypt. And in addition, places like Iraq and in southern Yemen, communist parties were either the biggest party, as was the case in Iraq in the 1950s and 1960s, the biggest and the most popular party in Iraq, and in Yemen, especially in southern Yemen, what was in effect the Communist Party there became so strong that it actually formed the government of South Yemen, and for a time South Yemen was in effect a socialist or communist state, very closely allied, and for many years closely allied with the Soviet Union. And this was also symptomatic of the Palestinian resistance at that time. In the 1960s and 1970s, and for decades thereafter, the Palestinian resistance was secular and left-wing, including Fatah, the biggest of the Palestinian resistance forces, which, by the way, in some respects was also the most conservative. But of course there were other more militant, more radical Palestinian groups to the left of Fatah as well, most of them in an uneasy alliance with it, and together forming the PLO. And what has happened is that as the United States worked with its allies to eliminate the left across the Arab world, in which, by the way, it was comprehensively successful, it in the process empowered Islamist groups who were, of course, profoundly anti-socialist, profoundly opposed to political leaders of a secular perspective, and who in the end were able successfully to capitalize and fill the gap left by the essential collapse of what might be called the Arab secular left. Now, of course, this wasn't exclusively the work of the United States other factors were heavily in play. But the United States did play a role, and to some extent so did Israel itself in its contest with the Palestinian resistance. It is, I think, widely acknowledged today, it is not controversial that Israeli governments and Israeli authorities for a long time provided covert support to Hamas, which they saw as a more pliable alternative to the radical, as it was seen, secular, left-wing Palestinian resistance led by people like Yasser Arafat. So when people do say that these Islamist movements that we have seen proliferate across the Middle East in the last few decades, when they say that they are, to some extent, a product of American policy and, in some places, Israeli policy, that is, of course, absolutely true. Now, I'm not going to say more about this. I think this is an important article, and I think it does provide context. I know a lot of people at the moment are saying that we should not worry about context. I find that a deeply misguided approach to policy altogether in every area, by the way. I know people are saying that. But for those who are interested in context and want to understand why we have got to this point, I would suggest go to Dancing with Bears and read that article by Helmer, which sets it all out in some detail. Anyway, so there we are. We are in a situation at the moment where there is a kind of stalemate. We don't know how long this is going to continue. At some point, despite claims that are made by some people, Bernhardt on the moon of Alabama being one, for example, he doubts that Israel will ever launch a ground offensive in Gaza. I personally think that politically that is unavoidable. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government won't survive unless they do, and I personally think that that kind of ground offensive now is inevitable and that the Israelis are indeed intending it. But for the moment, until that happens, we are in this strange, very strange and very unstable and dangerous condition where nobody quite knows what is going to happen next. There is a sense that the situation is deteriorating. Everybody waits to see what the Israelis are going to do, and the Israelis themselves seem less than sure of what it is that they're going to do or what the eventual plan is. And maybe there is a plan for the military campaign, but for the moment, everything looks extremely complicated. And we're hearing multiple different stories. We're hearing sometimes that Israel will blockade Gaza and try to bomb the Hamas forces into destruction. There is the plan, which undoubtedly did exist, I think, to try and get people to leave Gaza, or at least northern Gaza, and go to Egypt. I think that the fact that the Egyptians and the Jordanians pushed back so strongly against that plan is confirmation that it did exist and that they were put under pressure to agree to it. Anyway, there was that plan. There have been other plans. Now, I discussed yesterday a plan that I read about. I've seen more articles about this, about discussions that the United States and Israel are having about establishing some kind of government, many will say a puppet government, to control Gaza once Hamas has been defeated. I expressed my deep scepticism about whether such a plan was viable. Eve Smith has pointed out to me that Israeli spokesmen are now talking about something completely different. They're talking about cutting off all connections between Gaza and Israel entirely, closing all access points between Gaza and Israel, creating a kind of impenetrable barrier, a wall, if you like, not just a wall, but presumably with minefields and cameras and drones and all of these things, to make sure that Palestinians living in Gaza are unable to enter Israel, and that Israel and Gaza are completely sealed off from each other. And perhaps that's a slightly more realistic plan, but I wonder whether in the long term it is a sustainable one. But anyway, we have lots of these plans being floated about, but the very fact that we're hearing so many contradictory rumours about different ideas that people are coming up with, all that suggests that, for the moment at least, there is no single plan. There's perhaps no single military plan to decide how the military campaign is to be conducted, and there is no coherent plan about what to do when the operation, if it does conclude and conclude successfully, what to do after that. And it hardly needs saying that going into a conflict, a complicated conflict of this nature, with no plan at all, is a very bad idea, but that seems to be where we are. I say that because in my experience, when there are lots of plans being floating around and people coming up with all kinds of ideas, that is usually a strong sign that there is actually no single agreed plan at all. Anyway, we shall see what happens. Now, there's been a lot of reports coming from the United States about the situation in the US government. I read an article somewhere. By now it's becoming very difficult to remember where I've read all of these articles, but there was an article which suggested that there is now deep depression or stress within the White House, within the administration. This article, which I don't remember where it was saying that people within the administration are saying to each other that this is the greatest set of challenges that the United States has faced since the end of the Second World War, that it has this huge war going on in Ukraine, that it has this crisis now in the Middle East, the situation with China over Taiwan remains completely unresolved, and there are also growing worries about the state of the US economy, fears that spending is running out of control, that the deficit is too high, that bond yields are rising, and the pressure in the financial system is growing. And as I said, there were some reports that there is gloom and worry about the situation within the White House, and again, no real plan about the way forward. And I have noticed that there has now been increasing criticism of President Biden's diplomatic activity. I've discussed in several programs how I thought that his entire approach over the course of his journey to Israel was deeply misconceived. Whatever his intention, the overwhelming impression that it was conveyed was that he was giving Israel, in effect, a blank check. And we now have other reports which appear to suggest otherwise, but there is no visible evidence of serious pressure, either from President Biden whilst he was in Israel or from the American government since then, to try to persuade the Israelis to think carefully before they take whatever action it is that they do eventually intend to take. Anyway, I said that his trip almost certainly had exacerbated the situation in the Middle East, that it had deteriorated, caused a deterioration of the situation, that it had annoyed and alienated the Arab states, causing Arab leaders to decide that they no longer wish to meet with the president himself, which is an astonishing situation. And I said that the president compounded all these problems with what I thought was a disastrously misconceived address to the American people, in which not only did he offer no new ideas about the situation in the Middle East, and seemed unable to rise to the challenge of the crisis, but managed also to convey the impression that he is not really interested with the situation in the Middle East, that his own visceral feeling is that the conflict in Ukraine, the one with Russia, continues to be the more important one. Anyway, I said that the accumulation of all of this was damaging and that it had made the situation in the Middle East worse. And I noticed that there are more and more people starting to say this. I was particularly intrigued, for example, that Simon Tisdall, the foreign news editor of The Guardian, a person who has taken the most extreme positions with respect to Ukraine, who has given every impression of wanting to see the United States fight the Russians in Ukraine. Even he is now coming forward and criticising President Biden for his visit, saying that President Biden made a political mistake in appearing to get too close to Prime Minister Netanyahu, that Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly has no clear plan of the way forward, but is most likely to authorise a ground invasion of Gaza because, politically speaking, that is what he is obliged to do, even if he has no clear plan about what to do once it happens, and that a debacle is therefore developing in the Middle East. But the only time I can ever remember when Simon Tisdall and I find ourselves saying many of the same things. Well, even if people like Simon Tisdall are becoming critical of the approach that President Biden has taken, then that perhaps tells us that there really is a crisis now of confidence in his leadership, which I suspect is going to start spreading through all parts of the American government over the next few weeks. Meanwhile, it wouldn't be fair to say that the United States is remaining completely inactive. I spent a great deal of time discussing the various opening moves that the Russians and the BRIC states have taken in the UN Security Council. Yesterday, the United States tried to respond to the political damage that it has suffered through its opposition to two proposed UN Security Council resolutions which called for a ceasefire, one proposed by Russia, the second proposed by Brazil. Anyway, the United States yesterday proposed a draft resolution of its own. It severely criticises Hamas. It does appear to call, to some extent at least, for humanitarian assistance to be provided. But critically, it does not call for a ceasefire. Now, the Russians are certain to veto this resolution if it is ever put to the vote, which is perhaps doubtful. We shall see. Even allowing for the fact that the United States enjoys a structural majority in the Security Council, or has done so until very recently, I think that several countries that have supported the United States or routinely support the United States in the Security Council are perhaps less likely to support a resolution at this time which does not call for a ceasefire. So this resolution is bound to fail. But it's clearly been tabled by the United States in order to counter the impression that the United States is standing idle and to try to put the Russians back on the defensive. In my opinion, a ceasefire at this, a resolution, a draft resolution at this time that does not call for a ceasefire, not only has no chance of being voted through the Security Council, but is actually going to alienate Arab and Muslim opinion even more. The Arab states and the Muslim states, and of course people on the Arab street, will see this resolution, which does not call for a ceasefire, as providing further cover for Israel, and will see this resolution as, in effect, giving a further green light to Israel to escalate its military operations in Gaza. Far from this resolution repairing the damage, I think it is only going to make the damage worse. And again, I am very surprised that there are people in the United States government who don't understand that and who are not expressing their worries about this. Well, I say that there continue to be many rumours that, in fact, many people are indeed extremely worried. And there are, of course, reports which continue to circulate of a festering mutiny within the State Department, people there complaining about the policy, or rather the absence of any clear policy. And I even saw a report somewhere over the last few hours that there are now concerns, that these concerns are now spreading and are reaching some congressional staffers as well. That, in other words, the worry has spread from the State Department to Capitol Hill. Almost certainly, by the way, those will be Democratic Party staffers, that they're becoming increasingly worried and concerned about the nature of the policy, or lack of policy. Well, we will see, and we will see whether these dissenters have any success, but I do think that it is likely that there are these concerns, and if we do eventually see a public expression of this supposed dissent, which we have not yet seen at the moment, all we have are rumours, if we actually see this burst into the open, then it will be a direct product of the President's disastrous trip to the Middle East, the equally disastrous trip of his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and the growing doubts about the President's ability to lead the United States through this multiplicity of crises that we are now that are now developing. That there is growing doubt, and that people are becoming worried that more crises are now emerging on all sides, and that the United States and the administration are losing control. You can find in article after article across the media, even people like Daniel Hannan in the Daily Telegraph are writing in this way, and I've been seeing the contrast people are increasingly making between the axis, the so-called axis of authoritarians, Putin and Xi Jinping, who've just had that successful meeting in Beijing, that massive summit that took place there. People are increasingly making comparisons between what happened there and the disorganized approach to all of these multiple crises by the administration. And again, I think that another place where doubts must be growing must be the Pentagon. There is said to be a team of people in the Pentagon who have been put together to try to come up with some kind of plan to supply Israel with the weapons it needs. There was an article about this in, I believe, Politico. It spoke about how Israel has run through 8,000 precision-guided weapons in the 2 weeks since the crisis began, that the Pentagon is trying, therefore, to put together plans to supply Israel with the weapons and equipment that it needs and the financial support. I talked about a short moment ago about the worries that exist in the United States and in the US government about the state of the US economy and about the festering pressure, the growing pressure on the financial system. Of course, Israel also is facing economic and financial pressures. I think it was Moody's, one of the big credit rating agencies, has now put Israel on a negative watch. The fact that so many hundreds of thousands of reservists have had to be called up to make up the numbers in the Israeli army is undoubtedly going to have an impact on the Israeli economy. It's important to remember that Israel, despite its prominence in world affairs and its power, remains a small country, and calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists is inevitably going to have an impact on the Israeli economy, and recommitting every part of the economy to the war risks igniting severe inflationary pressures within Israel itself, as well as potentially a balance of payments crisis, as Israeli industries are put on a war footing, obliging in Israel to increase imports. Given which, in order to conduct its military operation in Gaza, and if this happens, fight its two-front war against Hezbollah, Israel will also need as well as military support, military supplies from the United States. It will also require financial support from the United States as well, if the Israeli economy is to keep functioning on a stable basis. Well, all of these strains, of course, exist, but the Pentagon, despite confident statements from US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin about how the United States is able to fulfill all the military needs of Ukraine and Israel both at the same time. Similar statements made, by the way, by the President, who said, well, after all, it is the United States, the world's most powerful country. Well, saying all of that doesn't overcome the fact that the United States has already depleted its arsenals significantly through its attempt to support Ukraine. It sent hundreds of thousands, millions of shells to Ukraine. It's accepted over weeks and months now that Ukraine is using more shells than the United States is itself producing. And now, on top of that, it has a further commitment, the scale of which nobody knows, and the duration of which nobody knows, to provide similar and analogous support to Israel. And apparently, and this was confirmed, or at least discussed in an article, and I believe it was Politico, there are worries within the Pentagon that these demands are just piling on, one on top of the other. Demands for Ukraine, demands for supplies to Israel, demands to keep Taiwan supplied to, and that the United States and its military industries simply cannot keep up. And I discussed the problems in the US economy. We did a very interesting live stream last week with Alex of Reportify on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, in which he discussed the problems in the financial markets and the growing worries about the condition of the financial system and about the possibility of a major crash in the financial markets. Well, at the same time as all of that is happening, we have Janet Yellen saying that, of course, the United States, despite its ever-expanding budget deficit, despite its balance of payments crisis, because that is what it is starting to increasingly look like, despite the spikes in its bond yields, despite all of those things, that the United States, of course, has the fiscal strength to be able to provide funding simultaneously for Ukraine and for Israel, supporting not just the military war effort of those two countries, but also keeping supposedly their economies stable and functioning as well. I've long discussed, I was talking about this long before the conflict in Ukraine began, that the United States was at serious risk of an overcommitments crisis, finding itself in conflict with the Russians in Europe, the Chinese in the Pacific, Iran in the Middle East, and that resources simply did not exist to meet all of these challenges at one and the same time. And I said, and I did, if you go back long enough, you'll find programs that I was doing in 2019 and 2020 discussing all of this, saying that what the United States most urgently needed was to negotiate with the Chinese and the Russians a geopolitical ceasefire to get itself time and space to get its own house in order, and it needed to recognise that it could not be strong in every place, all at the same time. Well, as we all know, the Biden administration, when it came into office, did exactly the opposite. Far from seeking a geopolitical ceasefire, it has fought a proxy war with the Russians in Ukraine, even as relations with China have deteriorated, as it has made efforts to try to suffocate the Chinese economy by blocking China's access to high technology, and as it has supported Taiwan. And of course it has neglected the Middle East. It has failed to take clear steps in the Middle East, either to reduce the conflicts there or to find some kind of diplomatic solution, and or even to seek, which would have been a policy, some kind of long-term strategic understanding with Iran. That would have been a potential policy. Anyway, it has done none of those things. And that commitments crisis that I was talking about and warning about all those years ago is now apparently upon us, and it is unsurprising, therefore, if it is indeed, if these reports about gloom and worry and stress within the White House and the National Security Council, well, if all those concerns are there, well, doesn't surprise me. It was there, it was going to happen, one could see it coming, and now apparently it has come. Well, anyway, there is no sign that any part of the administration has a clear idea of what to do. As I said, the best that they've been able to come up with so far is this draft resolution that they're proposing to the Security Council, which, as I said, is only going to make the situation worse. And I have come to the conclusion that, given the realities, the only way we're going to get through all of this, at least for the time being, is to let the situation play out. I don't think that the United States is capable, or at least this administration is capable, of proposing a coherent proposal to the Russians to resolve the war in Ukraine. The former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, has now, by the way, been talking about this. He's been talking about the way in which the Americans sabotaged the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in February and March 2022, and points out that there might have been a resolution of the military crisis between Ukraine and Russia within 3 days. Apparently the Ukrainians were already working at that point to meet the Russians halfway, and then in 3 weeks, and then in 6 weeks. We were very close to some kind of an agreement then, but of course the administration sabotaged it. And to be frank, I don't think that these people who are there running things in the administration have any idea or plan of how to get through this crisis in Ukraine at the moment. I don't think that they have any proposal that they can make to the Russians, which the Russians would agree to, and I don't think the Russians would trust them with any proposal that they did make. So I don't think that we're going to see a negotiation over Ukraine anytime soon. I think the Russians have come to that conclusion, and I think most of the world, by the way, has probably come to that same conclusion as well. And I don't think that the United States has any coherent plan, at least this administration has any coherent plan about what to do with the situation in the Middle East. I think the Arab states understand this, and I think, again, the situation is going to have to play out now with whatever plan or project or action Israel is going to take in Gaza, and that could lead to escalation with Hezbollah. I think there will be strenuous attempts to prevent the war escalating further and beyond that. But one way or the other, there will have to be a battle in Gaza. There will have to be a battle with, perhaps with Hezbollah in the north. Most likely it will be inconclusive, and most likely at that point there will be moves taken in the Security Council and in the General Assembly wresting control of the diplomacy in the Middle East from the United States. In other words, it's now looking increasingly difficult to avoid a debacle either in Ukraine or in the Middle East, because I don't think this administration is capable of formulating coherent plans to change direction or to alter policy. This, again, is astonishing to someone like myself, who remembers how the United States was able to negotiate its way out of the crises of the 1960s. Back in the mid-1960s, the United States found itself in a deep crisis in Vietnam. The US government at the time, led first by Lyndon Johnson and then by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, however, came to conclusions that the United States did indeed need some kind of geopolitical ceasefire. So in 1967, the process of détente with the Soviet Union was launched by President Johnson and Soviet Premier Kosygin following a meeting in Glassboro College, and that led to a whole succession of arms control treaties and a stabilization of the situation in Europe, and altogether the process known as détente. And of course, the Johnson administration also began, ever so tentatively, negotiations with the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, in Paris, and the following Nixon administration, Nixon and Kissinger, were able to move forward with a normalization of relations with China. And all of that was done and achieved in the United States. Of course, there was opposition, there was criticism, but the American government in those days still possessed the power of decision and was able to act upon it and eventually find a way through. The American government of today doesn't seem to be able to do that, and there doesn't seem to be any clear plan, and I don't expect that to happen under this administration. So, with a heavy heart, I have to say this, I think the only way that we're going to see events unfold over the next few weeks and months is to see them play out, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And for all I know, sooner or later in the Indo-Pacific as well. Anyway, let's now move on to that other big crisis, which is the one in Ukraine. And there's been quite a lot of information about that crisis as well. Firstly, there's growing worry apparently in Ukraine that with the emphasis on the Middle East, with Ukraine having to compete with Israel over funding for weapons, Ukraine is losing priority for the United States, notwithstanding that, as I've said previously, my own view is that in the case of the President himself, viscerally, for him it is Ukraine which takes emotional priority over Israel. That's my takeaway from his address to the American people of the other day. And I should say that already there are signs that the Ukrainian government is right about this. There's apparently been a strong pushback from Republicans, both in the House and in the Senate, against the administration's plan to link aid to Ukraine with aid to Israel. Various Republican senators and congresspeople have been pushing back. Apparently there's been letters sent by some Republican senators saying that these are two entirely different conflicts. It is simply inappropriate to lump them together in the way that the president is seeking to do. They have to be treated apart and separately, and far from the president's ploy of trying to lump all of these various spending requests together in one big single package being successful. For the moment at least, it looks to me as if it is achieving the opposite. It is actually going to make it more difficult for this package to pass, and I suspect the pressure will be on again to get funding for Ukraine and Israel separated, and to get funding for Israel increased and funding for Ukraine reduced. The president is asking for $61 billion for Ukraine and $14 billion for Israel. I suspect that even those Republicans in Congress who are sympathetic to Ukraine, strongly sympathetic to Ukraine, feel that this is an unbalanced package and that too much money is being given to Ukraine and not enough to Israel. And at the very least, they will want the two packages to be recalibrated in some way. Well, that will be bad news for Ukraine, because I'm already reading commentaries in Ukraine that they're saying that the $61 billion that President Biden is asking for Ukraine is nowhere near enough. And in fact, there have been further reports that, including one from the Royal United Services Institute, that Ukraine is facing a very harsh winter. The energy system is in a poor state after the Russian missile attacks of last year, that the economy altogether is in an almost catastrophic state, that the economy functions basically on financial infusions from the United States, which have been running at well over $1 billion a month, and that without that aid, it can't keep going. And as always happens, the need for aid increases rather than reduces, because as money is pumped into the economy from abroad, that inevitably has the effect of drawing away economic energy from what might be called organic parts of the economy, such as they are in Ukraine, to those parts of the economy which are better funded. And they are better funded because, of course, they're being funded indirectly, or indeed directly, by the United States. So why run a factory in a place like Kharkiv, which is being shelled and bombed continuously, when you can get yourself, shall we say, a food supply contract to provide food to the Ukrainian army, paid for with funding from the United States, using food which you can import from the West. So this is the effect that pouring money into an economy does. It creates distortions, and it becomes like a balloon with a hole in it. You have to blow in ever more air to keep the balloon inflated. You can't just keep a certain amount going in, because inevitably the hole gets, over time, bigger and bigger, and more of the air goes out. That is the iron rule of running an economy in this kind of way. And the Ukrainians, of course, they're looking at a cut in financial aid from apparently $1.1 billion a month from the United States to around $800 billion a month, when the reality is, in terms of the way in which their economy is functioning, they actually probably need more than $1.1 billion a month at that time, probably significantly more, simply in order to stand still. Anyway, apparently the Ukrainian government is becoming concerned about this, and of course it is becoming concerned about critical things like ammunition shortages and all of those kind of things. And of course President Zelensky himself wanted to show to the world, and of course especially to Congress in the United States, that actually the cause, his cause and Israel's cause, are one and the same. He wanted to go to Israel and to be photographed standing alongside Prime Minister Netanyahu, both victims of aggression. And of course the Israelis refused to let him come, not because they wanted to keep the Russians happy or to prevent the Russians from getting annoyed with them, but because they didn't want to fall for Zelensky's gambit. They didn't want President Zelensky to be able to come and say to Congress, look, you must give me what I need, because my cause and Israel's cause are one and the same. The Israelis didn't want him to be able to do that, because of course the Israelis understand perfectly well that he is in fact in competition with Israel for American aid, and the Israelis do not want to assist him in getting more aid from the United States at a time when they want to prioritize aid to themselves. And that was why the Israelis almost certainly rejected his request for a visit. So Prime Minister Zelensky is finding the situation increasingly difficult. And there was a very interesting and rather astonishing report or article in the Times by the military analyst Mark Galeotti. He's a military analyst discussing the Russian military. He's been around for decades. Somebody I used to follow very closely. I have to admit that I do so increasingly less nowadays. But anyway, he wrote an article also about the ATACMS, which have been supplied to Ukraine. And if what he says is true, then one can see how President Zelensky's problems might be increasing in other respects as well. Because if one believes what Galeotti is saying, and I don't know where he is getting his information, but if what he is saying is correct, then that ATACMS missile strike of a couple of days ago against the air bases in Berdyansk and near Lugansk was a shambles. it was a disastrous dud. I say that because according to Galeotti, no fewer than 18 ATACMS missiles were launched against these two bases at one and the same time. And that is, of course, consistent with some of the reports we've seen. One of the reasons for the secrecy in the supply of these ATACMS missiles, we have been told, is because there was a plan to try to take the Russians by surprise. So the idea was ship apparently 20, perhaps 21 of these missiles to Ukraine, wait until the Russians had their guard down, and then hit them with a massive punch. 18 missiles launched in two big salvos at two different bases, causing massive damage to the Russian Air Force, knocking the Russians badly down, with, of course, Ukrainian forces at the same time launching their assault across the Dnieper. Well, if that is correct, if Galeotti is right, that 18 missiles were launched, then, as I said, it was a debacle, because by his own admission, by Galeotti's admission, only 3 out of the 18 actually got through. The Russians either were able to shoot down all the others, or they malfunctioned and crashed to earth in all kinds of ways. These are older missiles. They're still apparently sophisticated missiles by most measures, but they're showing signs of age, and they're not precision guided in the way that some of the more modern ATACMS missiles are. So it may be that some of them malfunction. It does appear as if a significant number were shot down by the Russians. Electronic warfare by the Russians might have blocked others, and only 3 apparently did manage to get through. And they did do a certain amount of damage to the bases that they hit. Ukraine has published photographs of some of these bases. There's some discussion on the Russian internet as to how Ukraine has been able to get these photos. And there's lots of talk about people on the bases, security is not tight enough. I'm not going to go over all of that. But apparently what the photographs show is some damage done to helicopters, but apparently in the case of the damage to the airbase near Lugansk, the damage is repairable, and the same appears to be true of the damage done to the helicopters in Berdyansk. In other words, this was an attack that only did a limited amount of damage to Russian air assets at both of these bases. And Galeotti is a strong supporter of Ukraine. His article tries to put a positive spin on what happened. He makes criticisms of the Russians in various ways, though he does accept that they have shown resilience and an ability to adapt to the introduction of new weapons by the West, supply of new weapons by the West to Ukraine. But overall, I have to say, if what he says is true, and I do repeat again, I do wonder where he's getting his information from, a launch of 18 missiles is far more than I've seen anyone else suggest up to this point. 18 missiles. But if what he says is true, then the ATACMS flopped. Only 3 got through, and the damage they seem to have done is limited more limited than perhaps Galeotti himself acknowledges. Anyway, if this was an unsuccessful attack, then that might explain why this offensive across the Dnieper River that Ukraine appears to have been trying to launch over the last few days looks as if it is failing also. Now, I say this, I've discussed in previous programs that this whole offensive looks seriously underpowered. Ukraine has been sending small groups of troops across the river in boats. There's no single big amphibious assault. These troops then disperse in the woods and forests and then gradually move forward towards various villages and small towns on the east bank, attempting to occupy them. They then quickly become targets for Russian artillery and mortar fire, and also airstrikes as well. And airstrikes by the Russian Air Force in this area appear to be getting increasingly heavy. But anyway, it all seemed very underpowered. And I wonder whether perhaps the reason it was so underpowered is because there were more expectations that there would be a devastation of Russian air assets at Berdyansk, and the failure of the strike at Berdyansk, the disappointing results of the use of the ATACMS might have caused the Ukrainians to scale down their operation. I am not absolutely certain about this, and it could be that there are more things going on there than I fully know. But I would say that this morning, the very latest report I have seen is that the Russians have finally driven back or destroyed all of the Ukrainian units, small units that crossed the Dnieper onto the east bank, and that the entire east bank, every inch of it, as of now, is back under full Russian control. That, at least, is what some of the reports say. It may be that as we hear other reports, it could be that there are still some Ukrainian soldiers on the east bank, but for the moment at least, it doesn't look as if this offensive is being pressed hard in any significant way. Anyway, that's the situation in Kherson region. Elsewhere, the fighting in Avdiivka continues. There is deep fog of war about what exactly is going on. Today, Yuri Podolyaka, the Russian, he's actually from Sumy in Ukraine, but he supports Russia and he comments about the war from the Russian perspective. Anyway, he has been describing a major Ukrainian counterattack in the Avdiivka area, trying to push back or interrupt the work of the southern pincer that the Russians have been pushing towards in the area of Avdiivka. He claims that there is an ongoing battle going on and that the Ukrainians did manage to push back the Russians in various places, but he also admits that the situation is still unclear and that the fighting there still continues. And that's all I think I could say. There have been more claims that the Russians occupy the waste heap. There's a long discussion about the Battle of Avdiivka by Simplicius the Thinker, which he goes into huge amounts of detail and makes all kinds of comparisons with the fighting in Normandy in 1944. I'm not myself convinced that this is actually an especially helpful comparison, but anyway, there we are. So, intense fighting continues in Avdiivka, and continued Russian pressure apparently in the Kupiansk sector. The Ukrainians are again apparently ringing alarm bells about what the Russians are doing there. My own view is that yes, the Russians do ultimately intend, obviously, to resolve the problem of Avdiivka. And they've been steadily accumulating pressure around Avdiivka, and probably at some point they will work to get this difficult fortified area either surrounded or extinguished in some other way. And I suspect that this is the Russian plan. But I increasingly lean to the view discussed by Brian Beletic and Scott of Calibrated on a video that they did, I think, right at the beginning of this month, in which they said that the overall Russian plan is not to achieve a specific breakthrough in any one particular point, but just to accumulate pressure on every part of the Ukrainian front line until eventually the entire front line buckles and collapses as Ukraine finds it increasingly difficult to plug the holes. And I think that is what the Russians are doing, and they put heavy pressure on the Ukrainians in Avdiivka. They've obliged the Ukrainians to redeploy forces from all sorts of other places to Avdiivka. That will then open up possibilities for the Russians to increase pressure in places like Bakhmut, where apparently they are advancing, and of course in Kupiansk, which I was talking about. And then the Ukrainians will be left with the dilemma: do they reduce the forces that they've committed to defend Avdiivka in order to plug gaps in Kupiansk and these other places, even as Russian pressure starts to accumulate around Avdiivka again? And I think that this is the overall strategy, this attrition strategy that the Russians are following. And of course all of this continues with a very sophisticated bombing and missile offensive indeed. And there's apparently been discussions in Ukraine, even on Ukrainian television, about how sophisticated this Russian air offensive is now becoming, with the Russians apparently launching different types of bombs and different types of missiles at different targets, all at the same time, working to deplete Ukraine's already increasingly patchy air defense system, putting the Ukrainians under enormous pressure at various points. Again, one gets the sense of an accumulating pressure in terms of what the Russians are doing in terms of their air offensive, just as one gets that same sense with the ground operations. Now, here I would also point out that the Russians have announced that there has now been that the aerospace forces, the Russian aerospace forces that are conducting this aerial offensive, now have a new commander. He is General Avzalov, who used to be Surovikin's deputy. He's now the overall commander. We still don't know exactly what it is that Surovikin is doing, or whether he's doing anything exactly. But anyway, he is still somewhere. He's still on the active list of the Russian Defense Ministry, and I suspect that we'll be seeing him back again before very long. Before I finish on Ukraine, just a few more things to say. It is perhaps a further sign of how overextended the Ukrainians are becoming, that they're having to redeploy some of their Western equipment that had been earmarked for their offensive in the south to defending in all sorts of places now. So we see Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in Marinka, in Bakhmut. We've seen Leopard 2s out of the diminishing stock Ukraine has of these tanks being deployed now to the Avdiivka area. There are reports that Leopard 2s have also appeared in the Kupiansk area as well. One does increasingly get the sense of Ukraine firefighting and having to husband ammunition in order to concentrate it in small places along the front lines, whereas the Russians are able to keep firing away continuously. On the topic of ammunition, continue to be all sorts of reports of vast supplies of North Korean shells now reaching the Russian forces. There's even photographs which purport to show some of these shells and which point out that they are actually of recent manufacture. And Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has also been on a visit to North Korea, where he's had a meeting with Kim Jong-un. Clearly an awful lot going on between the Russians and the North Koreans, and obviously this remains a developing relationship. And when I spoke before about a commitments crisis that the United States is facing, it's important not to overlook North Korea as well. There continues to be a significant North Korean build-up. North Korea is now a significant nuclear power. It's got intercontinental ballistic missiles. It's got thermonuclear warheads. It's started work on submarines, which are apparently capable of launching long-range missiles, nuclear-tipped missiles. And of course, if the relationship between Russia and North Korea evolves to the point where the North Koreans start to gain access to Russian technology, well, the United States will have yet another problem on its hands. Now, I'm going to finish today's programme by making again the point which I made earlier over the course of it. If there are now apprehensions in the United States that the United States is facing a commitments crisis, this was easily foreseeable. What the United States could have done is seek accommodation with its adversaries, or at least with some of its adversaries. The Russians, in my opinion, had no interest in becoming adversaries of the United States in Europe. What they wanted was stability on their eastern borders. All that would have required was a commitment from the United States that Ukraine would not enter NATO, and steps by the United States to facilitate the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict through the already agreed plan set out in the Minsk II agreement. An agreement, by the way, enshrined in a resolution of the United Nations Security Council, which was voted for by the United States. So it should have been relatively straightforward to resolve the problems with Russia in Europe if that commitment that Ukraine would not enter NATO had been given, if real effort had been made by the United States and by its European allies to implement the Minsk II agreement, we would not have a war in Europe. There would not be the colossal Russian military build-up that we're seeing. Ukraine would not have become a black hole into which the United States pours unlimited amounts of money and weapons, only to find that however much it sends is never enough, and the United States would not have the crisis in Europe that it has at the moment. And with China in the Pacific, it could have been the same. There were legitimate trade issues between the United States and China, and that would have resulted in tensions. But the Chinese, intensely practical people that they are, would have worked towards finding some kind of accommodation with the Americans on these matters. But instead, what the United States did is that it overcommitted to Taiwan. It lured the political leadership in Taiwan to pursue a strategy of independence from China, and at the same time the United States put pressure on all its allies in Europe in order to suffocate China's technological development. And the result is China, which is an immensely powerful country, but one which, again, in my opinion, has no fundamental interest in becoming an adversary of the United States. Why would China want to become an adversary of the United States when the United States has been China's biggest market and the source of China's prosperity? Well, China, as a result, now does conceive of itself as a US adversary. And in the Middle East, again, a more straightforward foreign policy, understanding that the issue of Israel-Palestine is indeed intractable, but does require attention, might have kept the situation calmer and might eventually have found some way forward. But to the best of my knowledge, the United States, this administration, again, has failed to sort out US problems with Iran. It said that it would support going back into the JCPOA, but then didn't do so. It said that it would end the forever wars, but kept US troops in Syria. It talked about the need for a peace settlement within Israel and the establishment of a Palestinian state there, but to my knowledge it hasn't even appointed a special Middle East envoy, and has wasted time trying to achieve some kind of rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which seems actually to be intended less to stabilize the situation in the Middle East than to draw, and more to draw Saudi Arabia back again and away from the BRICS. Anyway, the administration could have done many things which would not have compromised US core interests and could have stabilized the situation. But this administration, the most completely neocon administration that I can remember, more so even than the administration of George W. Bush, what they did instead was that they went full speed ahead on all fronts. And in the United States itself, both in the first year and now again over the last 2 years, they have tried to turbocharge economic growth, less, I think, in order to resolve the underlying problems of the US economy, and more in order to compete and catch up with the inevitably higher growth rates that are going to be achieved by China. And the result is the commitments crisis and the potential financial crisis that we are seeing. If one wants the most extreme case of imperial overstretch, we are now seeing it, and it is the administration that has given it to us. Well, that is my programme for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find our programmes on all our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. You can also check out our... you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. You can also go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you have liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel.